Okay, today's daf, Be'ez Hashem, is daf Pei Hey Masechta Gittin. We will begin about 12 lines from the bottom of Pei Dalet Amud Beis. We learned in the Mishnah that if a guy said Hareyat Muteris L'Chol Adam, she wrote that you are permitted to everybody, except you're not allowed to marry my friend or whatever. I don't want you to marry him. So that's not a good get according to the Chachamim. And actually, if you said that, you have to retake back the get and give it back to her. Says the Mishnah, if you actually wrote the get, that condition, that I don't want to call it a condition, but you wrote Hareyat Muteris L'Chol Adam Chutz, except so and so. So then that get is puzzle. You can't give that get again, and you have to rewrite a new get. Amar Rav Safra said, Kosav b'soichaytnam. What puzzles the get is only if it's written this inside of the get. That's what the Mishnah says. So the Gemara asks, Shita, is Rav Safra not teaching you anything? Because that's what the Mishnah says. If it's written inside of the get, Hareyat Muteris L'Chol Adam Chutz so and so. So then it's a puzzle get. And says Kosav b'soichaytnam. So the Gemara says Rav Safra has a big novel idea. Mahu desema. I would have thought, Hani Mili, when does it puzzle the get? When does it puzzle the get if it's written inside? Is la'acher hatoref, after the toref of the get. Remember the toref of the get. Remember the reish, the real part of the get, or the requisite part of the get. There's two parts to a get: the names, and the name of the man, name of the woman, and the location. That's called the toref. And then the rest of the get, that's standard template. Okay, the toikif is the standard template. So the toikif has to be written lishma. So when does it puzzle a get? When you write the Hareyat Muteris L'Chol Adam Chutz so and so, is only if you wrote it after you wrote the names. Ava lifnei toref, but if before the toref, I would have thought without Rav Safra that it would puzzle a get if you verbally tell the sofer, hey, have in mind that I'm only allowing her to marry everybody but so and so. I would think afil al peh nami pasul. Even if you verbally tell the sofer how to write the get, that what your intention of this get should be, it would still pasul the get, although it's not written inside of the get. Kamash Malon comes along Rav Safra and says that's the point. The only time something passes a get is if it's actually written in the get. But if it's a verbal instruction that you're telling the sofer something that's not so kosher, that does not pasul the get. The Rava says, what makes a get puzzle if you wrote it after the toref? If you wrote this bad statement after you wrote the toref of the get, the names and the date and the place, before you even start writing the get, right? So afilu al peh nami puzzle. I would think that even if you say verbally, Hareyat Muteris L'Chol Adam Chutz so and so, then that would puzzle the get, because the sofer, as he's writing, he's thinking that as he's writing. And therefore, that's where Rav says that it would even be puzzle, even if you verbally said it. Rav said it goes according to his opinion. Rav would tell the soferim that used to write a get. That means they're sitting in front, the husband made the sofer a shliach to write a get, that the sofer should tell the husband, shtoiki shtuki lebal, tell the husband to keep his mouth closed, the kasfini leilotarf get, until you write the main requisite part of the get. Because if the husband opens his mouth, he could passel you as you're writing the get. That's what Rava said. So it's a very important part of the get. And I'm encouraging you, I'm going to send it out on the chat, these little videos on how a practical get is written today, and how the husband appoints the sofer. It's very informative type little clips that they have on the old Daf app. Anyway, Tana Rabbanim, we learned in the Brisa, Kol hatanoim poisonous a get. Any condition that you write in a get, that passes. Divri Rebbe. Now, this is a very interesting thing. Any divorce agreement, let's say, that you write in the get, let's say you say, okay, I'm giving you this get to condition that you deposit $200,000 in my bank. If you write it in the get, even though it's a valid condition, it would passel the get. Divri Rebbe. The Chachamim say, Kol she'poisal peh poisal b'ksav. Kol she'ede poisal peh poisal b'ksav. That means the only time a condition written in a get would passel a get is only if it's a condition that's an invalid condition. But if it's a valid condition that you can verbally express it, it could be written into the get document. So, for example, chutz, if you write you're divorced from everybody except you're divorced and you're permitted to marry anybody except so-and-so, if you write that type of condition in the get, that passes verbally, so it passes even if it's written in the get. Almanas, but if you give another condition, that instead of saying harayat materas chutz, accept this, but you say here's your get on condition, let's say you nurse my child, on condition you deposit 200,000 in my bank. This verbal condition is not a bad condition, and therefore it wouldn't possible if it's actually written in the get. So this was the machlekes between Rebbe and the Chachamim. Rab Zera modifies and explains the machlekes between Rebbe and the Chachamim. Remember, Rebbe said that every type of condition written into a get is possible. And now the question is, why would Rebbe passel that? So Amar Rab Zera explains, machlekes lifnei hatorev. If you wrote the condition before you actually wrote the main part of the get, if you wrote it, let's say on top of the page, then is the machlekes. Rebbe says it's possible. The Rebbe holds gazrin and almanas atachutz. Once you write a condition, almanas, you might come to write chutz. You might come to write an exception that she's permitted to marry anybody except so and so. And chutz actually makes the get invalid. So therefore, any condition you're not allowed to write in get, according to Rebbe. Rabbanan Sabri, Rabbanan hold, loy grazerina almanas atachutz. Rabbanan hold, you don't make any gezerah. If it's an almanas type of condition, that you can write it on top of the page of the get. But if it's a chutz, if you're saying a chutz that she can marry everybody but so and so, of course it's possible. But we're not going to say that you can't put any condition on the top of the get. Maybe you're going to put a chutz type of condition on top of the get. Avol la'achar hatoiref. But if you wrote the condition of, let's say, the condition of $200,000 after you wrote the main part of the get, which is the names of the get, if you write the condition there, we go to the top of the page, divrei hakol kosher. Even Rebbe would hold it's kosher. That is the opinion of Rab Zera. Umas nisen the ketonik sova vekminim chutz avam nas like possible. Our Mishnah seems to apply that if you wrote almanas in the get, it doesn't passel the get. So there are two ways to learn our Mishnah. Either ibay seima lifnei hatorev rabbanim. The Mishnah that says if you write almanas in the get, a condition in the get would not passel the get, is our Mishnah goes according to Rabbanan, that even if you write this condition almanas before you start writing the get, it would be kosher. So our Mishnah goes according to Rabbanan. If you wrote it lifnei hatorev, but not according to Rebbe, because Rebbe would passel in that scenario. The ibay seima, if you want, I could say that our Mishnah that says almanas, if you write a condition, would not pass the get. You wrote it after you wrote the main part of the get, and then you wrote the condition. Even Rebbe would hold that it's kosher, and that's how you would have to learn our Mishnah. So our Mishnah can either go according to Rabbanan, or it could go according to everyone. But Rava, okay, so Rava holds like this. Rava explains the machlokes between Rebbe and the Rabbanan is like this. The machlokes between Rebbe and the Rabbanan. Remember, Rebbe says you can't put an almanas in a get nowhere on the page, and the Rabbanan hold you could. Machlokes is la'achar hatoref. If you wrote it after the toref of the get, right? If you wrote it after the whole main part of the names of the get, you wrote the condition. There is a machlokes. The Rebbe Saba Gazrin Otu Lifnei Toref. Rebbe holds that if you allowed an almanas type of condition after the writing of the toref of the get, you might put it on top of the page. And then if you put it on the top of the page, if you allow almanas on top of the page, you might write a chutz on top of the page. Now, chutz is the worst thing you could write in a get, because you're allowing her to get married except to everybody except so and so. So that's why Rebbe says don't put any condition in a get. But Rabbanan holds like gazrina ata lifnei hatorev. We're not going to geyser if you write the condition in the get after the toref, that it would passel the get. Ava lifnei hatorev, but to write it on top of the page, divrei hakol passel. Everybody would hold it's passel, because even the Rabbanim would be strict that you can't write a condition, like you can't start the get and say this get is being given on condition you give me $200,000. Even the Rabbanim will say that cannot be the heading of the get. Umas nisa and ksava, the Our Mishnah says that if you write a condition into a get, it would not passel a get. Our Mishnah is achar torif, is talking about you wrote it after you wrote the torif of the get, and the only one that, according to Rava, makes a get kosher with you writing a condition after writing the torif is Rabbanan. It will go according to Rabbanan, because according to Rava, Rebbe would argue in such a case and hold that it would be passel a get. Tana, one more point over here, and then we'd start the new Mishnah. Tana avur the Rab Oven kamei the Rab Zera. Avur the Rab Oven said in front of Rab Zera, Tasvu al tnai divrei hakol pasel. He says there's a brisa that says that if you wrote a get on condition and you wrote the condition in the get, everybody holds its pasel. So the question is, according to Rab Zera, there's no situation that everybody holds its pasel. According to Rab Zera, if you wrote it, let's go back to Rab Zera's opinion. Lifnei haToref is a machlokes. Rebbe says pasel, Rabbanan says kosher. After the Toref, everybody holds it's kosher. So Rabbanan always hold, if you write a condition, it's always kosher in the get. So how could this brisa say everybody holds its pasal? Well, miflik piligi, they must be arguing. Ela Amos, Rab Zera corrected the brisa, and he said it must read in the brisa l'divrei hakol kosher. The brisa meant to say that everybody holds its kosher. And how is it possible that even Rebbe would hold that a get that has a condition in it, written inside of it, would be kosher? What would be that case? La'achar toref, if you wrote it after the toref. After you wrote the toref part of the get, if you write the condition, even Rebbe would hold that it's kosher. And that's how you square off that brisa, by correcting the text of the brisa so that it makes sense. Instead of saying divrei hakol pasel, the brisa meant to say divrei hakol kosher. So the Gemara says, v'lema, let the brisa say harei zeh pasel, the Rebbe. Maybe let's correct the brisa and say that the brisa is saying that only one of the opinions holds as pasel, and the author of the brisa is Rebbe, and you wrote it lifnei haToref. And that's and you're squaring off the brisa that way. So you could actually keep the word pasel, but instead change out the word divrei hakol and write harei zeh. Only Rebbe holds as pasel. Answers the Gemara, when you're correcting brises, you have to know how to correct the brises. Sometimes everything was done by memory, right? So Tana, divrei hakol asnuye kosher b'pasel michlef lei. Harei zeh b'divrei hakol lo michlef lei. If the brisa says, the brisa, it must say divrei hakol, because it's a person could forget. Did the brisa say it's kosher, it's pasel? That people could forget and change around the brisa. But if the brisa said divrei hakol and nobody exchanged it, that it should have said harei zeh. Or if the brisa said harei zeh, nobody would change it to divrei hakol. That's something that you wouldn't change a brisa to, because we trust the guy that memorized the brisa. He wouldn't have forgotten such a major point. But kosher and pasel, that's often people confuse it. Again, today's day and age, I don't think they write any tanoim, even though there's a separate divorce agreement. Obviously, there's always a divorce agreement, but they don't write it into the get. We always try to say that the get, no matter what, is being given under the free will of the husband, and under no conditions is he going to come back and say that, oh, you didn't keep the conditions. That's how I think we write a get today. So the Mishnah says like this. Remember we said that if you say you're permitted to marry everybody, but my friend you can't marry, so that's not a good get. What happens if a person says, you can't marry my father, your father. You can't marry my brother, your brother. You cannot marry a goy. Any person that she couldn't have married anyway. So basically, that's not called leaving out someone in the get. The get allows her to marry these people that was stating, oh, you can't marry your father and my father. She was usher anyway on these people. So therefore, that get is kosher. But if he tells her, you're permitted to marry everybody. Ella, but I don't want you to marry a Kohen Gadol. Almana l'Kohen Gadol. She was an almana from a previous marriage. He cannot restrict her from marrying a Kohen Gadol. Or Grusha l'Kohen Edo. He cannot restrict her from marrying another Kohen. Mamzeres Nesin Yisrael. If she was a mamzeres, she cannot restrict her from marrying a Jewish person. Or Bas Yisrael mamzer, or if she's a Bas Yisrael, she can't marry a mamzer noser. Anybody who she normally could marry, even though she would get an avera for marrying such a person, if you restrict her from marrying her by saying you're a get, you're a grusha woman, except related to these people, I consider you should be considered like an ashes ish. So he's making it impossible for her to marry such a person. So that would passel the get. That's not a good. That passels the get. So the point, the general rule is, if she was usher on these people because of arayas or something like that, and he says, "Oh, you're mutter to marry everybody but these arayas," well, she was usher anyway. So that's not a bad language of a get. But if he says that, "Oh, you can't marry a kohen," for example, well, she would have been permitted to marry a kohen, but you're saying that she's an ashes now to a kohen, although you're permitting her to marry anybody else. That language would not be a good language of a get. Klala de Milsa, the general rule, the general rule of the beginning of the Mishnah, Latu Yeshar Chayv Yakrisis, Kala de Sefer Latu Yeshar Chayv Leva. Any Chayv Yakrisis, any arayas, that's the general rule. If he leaves out any arayas, that would still make it a valid get. If he restricts her from marrying somebody who's a Chayv Lav, that would invalidate the get. Okay, now comes the Gemara's question. Remember, a person cannot say, you can marry anybody but my best friend. That you can't say. What happens? Rava asked a question from Nachman. Let's say he says to her, you can marry the whole world except this 10-year-old boy I don't want you to marry. Well, she can never marry this 10-year-old boy. Do you say Hashtami la baravayu? So therefore, there's no restriction over here because he can't marry a 10-year-old boy because there's no kedushin by a 10-year-old boy. But the fact is, one day this boy is going to get bar mitzvah, and by him restricting her from marrying that boy, so that's called leaving somebody out of the get. Is that a restriction that would invalidate the get? Amalei, so Rav Nachman answered to Nisuha, we have a brisa. Katana miskareshus b'kedushay avia. A katana, let's say her father married her off. A father can marry off his 7-year-old girl. Let's say the father dies. The 7-year-old can accept a get, even though she was mukudeshes midaraisa by her father. Now that her father's not here, if she gets a get, she could be the one to accept it. Now, Abai, don't we need that she should be a mature person, just like kedushin can only be done with a gedola? So also the get has to be a gedola. So how could she accept a get? She's 7 years old. Because one day she's going to be a bas mitzvah girl, so therefore she can accept the get. This boy is eventually going to become a bar mitzvah boy. So therefore, what the Gemara is trying to conclude is that if a man says to his wife, except this 10-year-old boy you can't marry, even though right now she can't marry, that invalidates the get, because one day this boy is going to grow up and she's going to be restricted on him. So that's not a fully permissible get. Let's say a guy says, you're allowed to marry anybody, but except somebody who's born right now, who's going to be born after the year 2023. Mao, is that a restriction? Right now, there's nobody born. But eventually people are going to be born, so you are restricting her. So Rav Nachman answered to Nisu, we learned that a restriction to an Eved, to a Goy, is not a restriction. But the truth is, it's not a restriction because she couldn't have married the Eved and Goy prior to the marriage. Right, so but there's a problem. An Eved Goy could eventually become Gerim. So you are restricting something that didn't happen yet. But it's still not called a restriction. So the Gemara says that's not a good proof. Hanach lav laguri kaima. Hanit lisnude kaima. Eved and Goy are not set up to become Gerim. Most likely they're not going to become Gerim. So therefore, it's not considered a restriction. But people are going to be born. So if a husband says to his wife, okay, here's your get, you can marry everybody, except people are going to be born after 2023. That's a restriction in the get. And therefore, it would invalidate the get. Let's say a guy says, you can marry everybody except your sister's husband. Now, a person could marry her sister's husband if her sister dies, right? It's just in her lifetime, a person can't marry two sisters, but if this one sister died, you can marry the other sister. So is that a restriction? Right now, she can't marry her so it's not a restriction because she can never marry her brother-in-law. Dilma, maybe Zimun de Maisa Choisa, but it's possible that her sister's going to die, and then she could have married the brother-in-law, and so it is a restriction in the get. Amalei Tanisa Lavid Lagoy Aved Vagoy Nam Avidid Megari. And not a good restriction is by saying, and not a apostled restriction is by saying here's your batar to everybody except this goy. But there's a possibility that an Eved Goy could be Megayer. And yet, the fact is that right now they're not Gerim. So therefore, it's not considered restriction. So Huadin, that Gemara wants to say that possibly so, that to her brother-in-law, since she can't marry her brother-in-law because her sister's married and her sister is alive. So we look at what is right now. So by him the husband restricting her from ever marrying the brother-in-law, that's not a restriction because right now she can't marry the brother-in-law. Answers the Gemara, but you can't compare. Geris loishchicha. A goy becoming a ger, that's not common. And therefore, that's not a restriction that invalidates a get if you say you can't marry a goy. Misa shchicha, but it's possible that her sister is going to die, and therefore by him saying, "Oh, you can marry everybody but your sister's husband," that could be a restriction that would invalidate the get. What happens? A guy says to his wife, "You're permitted to marry anybody, but I don't want you to have znus with anybody. You can't have an affair with anybody." Chutz miznusech. Is that a restriction that holds up the get? Maho benesian holashir. He didn't restrict her from marrying anybody. He permitted her to marry the whole world, except he wants her not to have znus. Oidilna shayababir. He left over that she can't have relations with anybody. She can't have out of wedlock relations, and that's called leaving something over in the get. Amalei tanisa la'abalavich. One of the restrictions that the Mishnah says that's not apostles a get if he invalidates her from marrying a father and mother. What does the Mishnah says? What kind of condition did he make with her? If he told her that you can't marry your father and mother, how could that have been the condition? You can marry everybody but your father and mother. No one can marry their father and mother. Elalav, what he is restricting her is biznus. He's restricting her from sleeping with her father and his father. So, and what the Mishnah is saying, only if that's not considered a restriction if he restricts her from sleeping with his father or her father. But if he restricts her from having a znus with a stranger, sheer, that is something left over that would invalidate the get. So that would solve your problem. Answers the Gemara, no, Dilma benesuin the of it insid. What maybe our Mishnah is only talking about, not talking about znus. He's actually talking about restricting her from ever marrying the father, even though the marriage would be a mock wedding. But that's what he meant. Yeah, I don't want you to marry your father and my father. But znus, perhaps znus, if he allowed her to marry everybody, but said you can't have an adulterous relationship, maybe that wouldn't passel the get. What happens? He restricts her. You see where we're going over here. A man is trying to say you can marry, you could do whatever you want, marry, except chutz mishloike darka. I never want you to have a sex in the wrong direction. So he's like getting very personal with her. Mao. Maybe he allows her to have relations with anybody the normal manner, and so that's not a bad restriction. Or maybe mishkavei isha, the Torah, you have to allow the woman to be able to sleep any which way she wants. So that is a restriction. A guy says, I want to be responsible for nullifying your promises. Maho, is that a restriction? In other words, you can marry whoever you want, but Forest Nadarim, I still want to be the husband. He never restrict her from marrying anybody, so that there's no restriction there. The Torah says the husband is the one that could be made for a neder, can nullify a neder, and by him maintaining the rights to made for the neder, he's still considered her husband. So that's not a good get. Well, what happens? He says chutz mitrumaseh. He says to her, I'm giving you the restriction from ever eating from, I want you to, he was a Kohen, right? And he's divorcing his wife. And he's saying, you can marry whoever you want, but I want you to be considered my wife so you can eat truma for the rest of your life. That's the way Tosfos explains. So what's the Mao? He didn't restrict her from marrying anybody. But the Torah says that by you allowing her to eat your truma, if the first husband says, you should be considered my wife, that you could eat truma of mine, that means you're basically saying that she's still your wife. So that would invalidate the get. Or chutz mirusha, he says that I should be the one to inherit you. In other words, he says, here's your get, go marry whoever you want, but if you die, I'm the one that inherits you. Benusuyin har shaya. Do you say he allowed her to marry anybody? He's only the husband can yarshin her, and if you still want to call yourself the husband you're the one inheriting her, then that's not called a get, because you're still considered her husband. Or chutz, the final question, and this will end this piece. Chutz mikedushayach bishtar. He says to her, you can marry anybody, but you can't take kedushin with a document. It's either with money or with bia. Mao. He allows her to marry anybody, just use kesef and bia. He has to permit her to get married any which way she accepts kedushin, and he cannot put a restriction in the get that restricts her from ever being married b'shtar. So basically, these are clauses that the Gemara asked, would that invalidate the get? And the Gemara says, teiku. Mishnah, now here's what I'm talking about. Another 4 or 5 minutes, and then we'll stop. The Mishnah says, this is the most important Mishnah in all of Masechta Gittin. Gufa shall get. What is written in actually in get? Harei at mutaris l'chalatim. That's what's written in the get. You are permitted to anybody. Now, this is not an open statement, because by saying you're permitted to anybody doesn't really say what. What could she do? It just says you're permitted. Does that mean she could walk in the park by herself? So that's what the Chachamim said. Just writing that is enough. Rabbi Yehuda says, I think this is what we do in a get. You have to write more than that. This should be for me to you. Sefer Terichim, Iger Shavichim, the get Peturim. He has to really describe that all these things, we're severing our relationship over here. I'm not responsible for your food, your clothing. I'm not allowed to live with you anymore. You're allowed to marry any person you want. So Rabbi Yehuda says it has much more words in that. That's Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. Gufay shall get shichra. What is the main text of a freedom document? So here doesn't seem that there's a machlekes. If you want to free your slave, all you got to write in the document, Harei Pascharim, you're a free man. Harei La'atzbecha, you're an independent person. You don't work for me anymore. So the Gemara says like this, Pshita, it would be very simple. Amalal Ishta, if you write in the document to your wife, Harei Pascharim, you are a free person. Lo yamol leklum. You didn't say anything, because by saying she's free means she doesn't have to work for you. Because but it doesn't free her to marry anybody. If you say to your maid, you can marry anybody. That's not a good language for a maid. That's a good language for a married woman, but not for a maid. But now the Gemara says like this: if you told your wife, you now belong to yourself. Mahu, what is that? Is that a good language? You're now independent. Mao, legamre kamala. Did he mean that you're independent, that you now can do whatever you want to marry whoever you want? Or did he mean that you can work wherever you want, but you're still married to me? So it's not a good language to put in a get. Amalei Ravina Ravashi. Ravina said to Ravashi, Tashma de Tanab. Our Mishnah seems to say that it is a good language even for a woman. Gufish get shechra. The main text of freeing a slave is saying Harei at Bascharen, Harei at la'atzmech. You are an independent person. So what do you really own of a slave? You own more of a slave than you own more than a wife. Because with a slave, you actually you're the property of the master. Okay, so if a slave loses a tooth, the tooth belongs to the master. So you're really the property of the master. And by saying hareyat la'asbech, you're freeing the slave. So certainly, if it frees a slave, it certainly could free a woman who you don't actually own her body. Just like a slave who you actually own the body. If you say you belong to yourself, Koni Gufe, you own her body, okay? A woman that you don't own her body, certainly saying Harei Atla Atzmech is a good enough text for a woman. Now, let's go one more point, and then we'll stop. Amalei Ravina la Ravashi. Ravina said to Ravashi, Amalei la Avda, you say to your slave, it saves, instead of saying in the document, you should go free, Eili Asik Bach, I want to have no business with you. What is that? Mahu, is that a good get? Is that a good get shichra? Amalei Rav Chanan Ravashi, so Rav Chanan answered this question to Ravashi. V'amillah Rav Chanan Mechazno Ravashi. Tashma, come in here. I'll prove to you that Eli Asik Bacha is a good language. Tashma, the Tanya we learned in the Brisa. Hamoicha Avde Legoy. If you sell your Evet Kanani to a goy, remember an Evet Kanani has religious mitzvahs that he has to do, right? And if you sell him to a goy, basically the Chachamim knast you that Yotzer Lecheres, that if he runs away from the goy, the Evid will automatically go free. V'tzarach get shichra merabe rishon. But we forced the original master who sold him to a guy to write a get shichra. It's a knas, because by you selling him to a guy, you're basically forcing him to lose the religion. So not only if he goes free, but actually the first master has to write him a get shichra. You don't have to write him a brand new get shichra. Reb Shimon ben Gamliel says, if prior to you selling him, if you wrote something on a piece of paper, that would actually be his freedom document. He doesn't have to come back to you as a master and for you to write a new freedom document. If you wrote something down before he ran away from the goy, then that would be enough. My oine, what did you actually write down? Here's the point. Amar Rav Sheshes, the cost of lay, while the master was selling him to the goy, he wrote, L'kishtivrach mimenu, if you're able to run away from the goy, Eili Asik B'cha, I want to have no business with you. That's enough, and you don't need a new get shichra, because by writing Eili Asik B'cha, that's enough to be considered a get shichra. So we see that this language of Eili Asik B'cha is a good valid text when you're freeing a slave. Okay, tomorrow we're going to discuss more about the text of a get, and I'm going to send out these video clips regarding the text of a get and how practical writing of the get.